Good morning and welcome to our final day of the 2023 ELAP Conference. I'm Jen McLaren, Conference Co-Chair, and we are glad you have joined us this morning for the best ELAP conference under the sun. Our first two mornings were filled with fantastic presentations and thoughtful Q&A sessions. If you happen to miss either of those days, we invite you to watch them on the ELAP YouTube channel. There's a link to the YouTube on our conference webpage, as well as in the chat box here. If you've joined us for the last few mornings, you probably have my opening memorized by now, but just in case we have a few first timers, I'll go over the basics one more time. We're using Teams Live to accommodate the large number of attendees. As an attendee, you can't unmute yourself or turn your camera on. Any questions you wish to pose to our presenters can be done through the Q&A chat box. We encourage you to put your name in the space provided. On your screen, you should see how to submit your questions via chat. During today's event, feel free to send in your questions throughout the morning at any time. We will pose questions to the presenters at the conclusion of their presentations. We also invite you to join in on the conversation at Slack. We're having a great time interacting with many of you there. Several presenters and ELAP staff are answering questions and chatting with participants. It just adds a little something to the virtual conference experience. There's a link to join Slack on the conference webpage, and we also have it available through a link in the chat box here as well. Today's theme is the final countdown. We'll start with a presentation from one of our T&I early adopters, followed by ELAP's own Kate Hilty and Chris Hand with some tips and tricks. And finally, we'll hear from all of our TPAs with great practical application to be ready for T&I. So let's get ready to launch into the great day that we're going to have today. Kelvin Ewan is the Supervising Scientist of Quality Assurance and Supply Services at the Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from UCLA and a Master of Science in Environmental Engineering from Loyola Marymount University. With over 20 years of experience in environmental testing and analysis, he currently oversees various quality assurance programs, including accreditations, corrective actions, document control, ethics and data integrity, method validation, proficiency testing, and support equipment verifications. Most recently, as the laboratory section's designated quality manager, Kelvin is responsible for implementing the 2016 TNI-2 regulations across the 10 LACSD laboratories. This morning, he's going to talk to us about his experience with that. Please welcome Kelvin.
All right, thank you, Jen, for the warm introductions. Good morning, everyone. It is truly an honor and pleasure to be here today and share our story as early adopters of TNI-2. So the title of my presentation is From Launching to Orbiting, How LACSD Became an Early Adopter of TNI-2, thus matching the theme of the conference. Over the past few years, the lab community have faced a host of challenges, including the pandemic, supply chain disruptions, adopting the new regulations, and even the 2017 method update rule. So through the story I will share, I hope to provide insightful information that inspire you and prepare your lab for TNI implementations. So as introduced by Jen, my name is Kelvin Yun. I serve as the Supervising Scientist of the Quality Assurance and Supply Services Group at the Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts. Next slide, please. So before diving into the main part of the presentation, I have prepared a few slides just to give you an overview of LACSD and the laboratory sections, setting the stage and highlighting the challenges that we encounter in implementing TNI. So LACSD is a public agency consisting of 24 independent special districts, serving approximately 5.5 million people in Los Angeles County. Our service area covers around 850 square miles and includes 78 cities and unincorporated areas. The districts operate and maintain 11 water reclamation and wastewater treatment plants, shown as purple and blue triangles, which handle about half of the wastewater in LA County. Collectively, the sanitation districts treat more than 400 million gallons of water per day, making us one of the largest producers of recycled water in the nation. Additionally, the district operates 2 sanitary landfills and 3 materials recovery and transfer facilities to convert solid waste into resources. Next slide, please. I'll click one more time. So to support our district's operations and meet regulatory requirements for short holding time samples, we have 10 laboratories performing analytical testing, basically 1 at each wastewater treatment plant, except for La Quinada, where we discharge reclaimed water to a local golf course for irrigation purposes. So our laboratory staff consists of over 170 individuals, with majority holding at least a bachelor degree in biology, chemistry, microbiology, and other relevant fields. The SGC and JW laboratory on the first 2 lines are the main facility with advanced technology, requiring a high level of user understanding, including GCMS, ICP, ICP-MS, HPLC, toxicity testing, and more. So we also operate 8 smaller treatment plant laboratories located throughout the Los Angeles County. These 8 outlying labs conduct process control, wet chemistry, microbiological testing. Altogether, we conduct 450,000 analyses, excluding QC per year on water, air, and soil samples. Click, please. So based on our records, we have maintained ELAP certification for decades. In fact, as shown on the screen is the ELAP certificate for the Rio de Janeiro treatment plant laboratory. We were accredited by the Department of Public Health back in 1970, before the California Environmental Laboratory Improvement Act came into effect in the late 1980s. So you can observe some document control elements on the certificate in the lower right corner. Although the revision number appear to be truncated, Form 245-302A is the unique identification of the certificate template, and the issuing authority was the chief of the Sanitation and Radiation Laboratory. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So now let's take a look at the organizational structure of our laboratory sessions. So under the supervisions of the manager or laboratories, the lab sessions consist of 5 main subsections: the Joint Water Pollution Control Plan, Water Quality Labs, Biological Sciences, Research, Organic and Client Services, Treatment Plan Laboratories, and Quality Assurance and Supply Services. Overall, the laboratory sessions provide analytical support services for the district's wastewater treatment and landfill facilities. We offer technical and analytical support to internal and external agencies, including LA County District Attorney and as well as the US Department of Justice. In addition to chemistry, microbiology and biology groups responsible for analyzing compliance, process control, samples, and conducting research, we also have a client services group which acts as a project management team. This group handles project initiations from both internal and external clients. They also establish data quality objectives, manage subcontracting activities, and coordinate data reporting to end users. Like you learned from Sam's presentation yesterday, we also have an ocean monitoring group called Marine Biology under the JWPCP lab. This group is responsible for conducting NPDES permit monitoring to assess the impact on ocean receiving water and nearshore outfall stations. To facilitate our work, we also utilize various monitoring vessels and a remotely operated vehicle. These resources allow us to conduct biological, chemical, oceanographic studies along the Palo Verde's coast and inspect the ocean outfall system at JWPCP. My group, the QA and Supply Services Group, is on the far right of the organizational chart. I directly report to the manager of the laboratories to ensure impartiality and independence operation from the lab functions. Within the QA group, we have 8 professionals, including myself, who are responsible for various tasks. So these tasks include conducting internal audits, maintaining accreditation and certifications with ELAP, Arizona Department of Health Services, and South Coast AQMD. We also verify support equipment, manage corrective action program, review more than 350 SOPs and policy every 2 years and more. So now you have a general understanding of the complexity of our lab operations. Let's delve into the meaty part of the presentation: how we became an early adopter of TNIS-2. So in March 2020, after working in QA for 4 years, I was promoted to supervising scientist with the task of implementing the 2016 TNIS standard. So, however, have you remembered the COVID-19 pandemic hits, brings significant changes to our life and work routines. I remember sitting in front of the computer feeling a little lost, but I just try to remain positive, knowing that great things always start small. So I just decided to Google on how to create an implementation plan, and this is where we started. So we conducted a gap analysis and developed a 3-year implementation time to plan to meet regulatory requirements, To aid us in our efforts, we utilize the quality system checklist for the 2016 TNI laboratory standard, which can be downloaded from the TNI website for free. So this checklist is in Excel format, transform requirements into questions that help us assess our compliance with each QMS requirements. With the completion of the gap analysis, we created an implementation plan that outlined the necessary steps for the next 3 years. So by the end of 2020, we have updated the quality manual to incorporate the 26 management and technical QMS requirements as specified in volume module 2 of TNI. We also implemented a remote or hybrid internal audit program using Teams and began assessing the 10 laboratory against the TNI standard. In 2021, we completed the update of the 350 SOP and policy to the TNI format. We scheduled 3 pre-assessments for the main labs and 1 outline laboratories, addressing the finding recommendations before undergoing the T9-2 assessment in late 2022. So after addressing the finding with root cause analysis and corrective action plans, we submit amendment application to ELAP, plus becoming an early adopter of TNI-2. So the implementation process has proven to be more intricate than initially anticipated. So over the past 3 years, we have encountered numerous challenges that require addressing before reaching our current stage. So I just want to show you a snippet of our implementation timeline. We color-coded the status of each QMS requirement to check areas that are not implemented, partially implemented, or completed. This visual presentations really help us monitor our progress and communicate our ideas and message more effectively with other lab groups. In the interest of time, I would like to shift our focus and go over 3 critical management requirements of the quality management systems. They are document control, corrective actions, and internal audit. This specific requirement presents significant challenges with our laboratory. So let me just provide a little bit more details on how we effectively overcome these obstacles. So let's start with document control. So what exactly is document control? Essentially, TNI mandates that laboratory establish and maintain procedure to control all documents. This include periodic review, specific documentation requirements, chain tracking, unique identification, creation of a document master list or equivalent, and more. So, but however, like larger agencies like us face unique challenges. How do we effectively control thousands of documents and make them accessible to all 10 laboratories? So to tackle this problem, we implement a tier approach. We divided documents into 2 tiers, Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1 documents, such as training checklists, forms with instructions, controlled by the respective lab groups. This provides them with the flexibility to manage their operation without constant involvement from the quality assurance group. On the other hand, Tier 2 documents, including standard operating procedures, policies, and regulations, are controlled by the QA team. This ensures that documents affecting the entire lab sessions are maintained with consistency, comprehensiveness, and up-to-date information. By the way, I just want to point out that similar to Augustine's presentation yesterday, I also used AI to generate picture with a space-like theme. But of course, I'm not quite satisfied with the quality of the picture on the left. I think I'll get in touch with Augustine and ask him for guidance on how to create an AI prompt to generate high quality pictures. Sorry, just go off on a tangent here. Anyway, to facilitate document management, we utilize a system called Open Text DMS, Document Management System. So this system allows us to store, manage, and secure documents in a server or cloud environment. So each document in the system has a unique profile, which include a title, effective or issue dates, and a history of edits. Additionally, we can assign different access rights to control document handling. Some users can only view the documents, while others can edit and copy them. All we need to do is to choose the level of security that we want for the party involved in this screen here. The folder system, click please. So the folder system within the document management system serves as an equivalent document master list. We keep all the quality management system documents organized in dedicated folders, which are named after each lab groups. Since the system is implemented on a server or cloud, all documents are accessible across all 10 laboratories. Next slide, please. So let's discuss corrective action now. When it comes to corrective actions, TNI requires the creations of a written policy procedure, as well as the designation of appropriate authorities to address non-conforming work or deviation from the policy procedure within the QMS or technical operations. Prior to implementing TNI, we used to generate a corrective action report for every QC failure, such as like LCS, MSD, surrogate, internal standard failures. However, as you can imagine, this poses significant challenges in monitoring these non-conformances. How do we find the resources to effectively track these corrective actions? So fortunately, for those who attended the ATLA QMS training, we have come to understand that not all non-conformances require comprehensive corrective actions. The necessity of corrective actions really depends on the magnitude of the problem, the risk of recurrence, and its potential impact on future test results. So as a result, the scope of the corrective action may vary from time to time. So to ensure that our corrective actions remain practical and meaningful, we have adopted another tier approach that categorize non-conformances into two groups. Can you go back one click, please? Yes. Category 1 and Category 2. Category 1 non-conformances are evaluated by the lab groups and determined to be either defined in the SOP related to sample matrix or singular event. So statistically speaking, occasional deviation from acceptance range, acceptance criteria are expected in QC results. In general, if the result can be reported with qualification, we consider it as a Category 1 non-conformance. Generally, if the action is documented in the SOP, there's no need for the lab to submit a corrective action report to QA. However, the caveat is that if a Category 1 non-conformance is identified as to be a recurring issue, indicative of a systematic error, it must be reclassified as a Category 2 non-conformances. So for Category 2, the laboratory group must submit a corrective action report encompassing root cause analysis, a corrective action plan, implementation timeline, resolutions, and assign the responsible personnel to the QA group. Click, please. To monitor the effectiveness of corrective actions, we employ Excel tracking sheets that assign a risk factor to each non-conformance based on likelihood and severity. So our aim is to implement risk-based thinking in relation to our laboratory activities by developing a risk-based decision-making framework. We can effectively identify critical events, mitigate risks, allocate resources, prevent recurrence of adverse incidents. In this case, we only utilize like a 3x3 risk matrix. But when you search for risk matrix in Google, you find all sorts of risk matrix. Some of them are 4x4, 6x6, even 10x10. But for us, as the beginning of implementing this risk-based thinking, we just want to start small with the 3x3 matrix. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about internal audits. T9 requires that the internal audit program address all elements of their quality management system and associated methods. But how do we meet this requirement during the pandemic? The answer obviously is the implementation of the remote or hybrid internal audit program. What is now considered normal was unprecedented when the pandemic began. So in early 2020, we established a hybrid internal audit program that allows the QA team to conduct either remote audit using Teams or in-person audits. Click, please. So to ensure comprehensive coverage, we create an internal audit schedule at the end of each year for the following year, ensuring that all 10 laboratories are audited on an annual basis. We also audit our own group to the same QMS standard, setting an example and avoiding any double standard. Click, please. So 2 weeks prior to conducting an internal audit, the QA teams prepares a record request form asking the lab to provide relevant information such as training checklists, IDOC, ODOC, MDL determination, and ongoing data collections. We also ask for other records for support equipment, chain of custody, sample receipt form, so that we can look at the lab operation from a holistic perspective. Click, please. So after the internal audit, which typically spans 30 days, the QA team summarize the findings and recommendations in an internal audit report. The laboratory then has 30 days to respond, providing the root cause analysis, corrective action plan, implementation timeline, and details regarding the monitoring of corrective actions. Based on the laboratory response, QA updates the status of each finding accordingly. The status of each finding can be in progress, complete, need information, or remove. We may schedule follow-up meeting to discuss further on lab responses that need further clarifications. We also incorporate the periodic in-depth data monitoring, which is part of the ethics and data integrity requirements into our internal audit report, internal audit program. So during internal audit, we will audit a method from cradle to grave, from sample collections to data reporting, to ensure the method meets the QMS requirements. On average, QA conducts 2 internal audits per month to ensure that the quality management system of the laboratory section is reviewed on an annual basis. This hybrid internal audit program help us maintain the integrity and effectiveness of our QMS, even during challenging times such as the pandemic. Next slide, please. Okay, so this finding, the T9 assessment finding, they are identified through the pre-assessment and T9 assessment conducted by the third-party assessors. So I specifically choose this finding because they were discovered during a more thorough examination of our records. So keep in mind that during the past 3 years, we have meet majority of the T9 requirement, have policy and procedure in place to meet all the QMS elements. So the TPA actually looked deep into our records to be able to find some findings. So they tend to go into the weeds of our operations and then look at that from the record control and document control standpoint. So number one, not all documents were uniquely identified. Obsolete documents were not removed from point of use. Our current document control procedure is to remove obsolete documents from an active DMS folder to a folder marked as for retirement documents. But for some reason, we failed to remove one out of 350 SOPs to the obsolete folders. So I don't know how the TPA was able to find it, but that's what we get cited for. So to address this finding, we immediately removed the SOP from the active folders and place it in the retire document folders. And also, they were able to find some documents that were not uniquely identified. Some document may share the same name across all 10 labs. So we do have to specify in the profile that, on top of naming the document in certain way, we want to put, let's say, the lab groups in there too. So just to differentiate between similar document between the two labs. Number two, the laboratory had not met historical reconstruction of data. This is really tricky because TNI always emphasize that if you did not write it down, it did not happen, right? So when TNI assessor look at our operation, they will look at whether they can find informations in limbs or bench sheets that meets the SOP requirement. So some of the example for not meeting this requirement is records for COD and analysis did not include result of a chlorine check following dechlorination. So as a wastewater treatment agency, then we analyze BOD on a weekly or a monthly basis. We always have to dechlorinate our final effluent samples. So in our SOP, we mentioned that, of course, we have to dechlorinate with sodium thiosulfate, and the TPA basically is looking for a checkbox. They may not necessarily look at the details of the dechlorination process, but at least you should have a checkbox to say that, okay, this sample has been dechlorinated, has been checked for chlorine, stuff like that. Another example could be records for pH analysis did not include probe identification. So again, we have to include all raw results to meet this historical reconstruction of data. So when they look at the bench sheets, they will look for identifications of all the support equipment or instruments. In this case, we did not include the probe identifications on the bench sheets. I mean, we do have the identification of the pH meter, but the probe can change from time to time. So they want us to incorporate the probe identification of the bench sheets. Another example would be the settleable solid did not include method-defined agitation and wait time. So as you know, then when you run settleable solid, you have to stir it after 45 minutes, and then you have to read it at certain times. So they want details of those records somewhere to be found in limbs or our bench sheets. Okay, number three, the laboratory had not performed annual calibration or verification for all temperature measurement devices. Here, I specifically refer to the ATC probe. So of course, you understand that pH analysis always come with automatic temperature compensation probe, because pH measurement is heavily dependent on temperature. So the TPA consider this as a support equipment, so they want us to verify the probe on an annual basis to ensure that it meets specification. But of course, the challenge here is that even though you can verify the probe, you cannot assign any correction factor, right? Because the pH is determined automatically by the pH meter. So the way we tackle this problem is that we just set some kind of acceptance criteria, as long as when we verify the ATC probe against the reference thermometer, as long as the temperature is within certain range, is considered acceptable. Number four, the laboratory had not documented photo period verification. So this is related to toxicity method requirement, which I'm not an expert in this regard, but in the toxicity protocol, it requires that photo period should be 16 hours of light and 8 hours of dark in those environmental chambers in incubators. I believe this is a recommendation, but of course, when you look at the T9 requirement in Module 7, it's stated that photo period for toxicity analysis shall be documented at least quarterly. So they're looking for a record of this. So our previous practice is to review the light program setting on individual incubators and environmental chambers to ensure light level were programmed correctly. But it seems to me that the TPA want to visually confirm the required light and dark condition were met over time. So we cannot just rely on a light program to meet this requirement. So of course, I mean, our struggle is that, I mean, we're not gonna, ask people to work OT at night just to visually meet this requirement, even though it's just a quarterly requirement. So I believe we install a camera capable of continuous recording to record and verify condition of 16 hours of light and 8 hours of darkness within 24 hours, and we just do it in a quarterly basis. Number 5, records could not be retrieved of exactly 2 minutes and exactly 8 minutes for color development processes for cyanide analysis. Standard method 4500 cyanide, the colorimetric method, require after you add certain reagent, I believe after you add chloramine T, you need to let it sit for 2 minutes for color development, and then another 8 minutes after you add the pyridine barbiturate PBA, right, reagent, I believe, some kind of pyridine reagents. So they're looking for the time record of this because of how stringent the method requirements are. They want to emphasize because, hey, the method asks us to let stand exactly 2 minutes. They need to look for the record of the times. Number 6, records of temperature during waste extractions could not be retrieved. So for those who are accredited for this method in CCR Title 22, the method required temperature during extraction be maintained between 20 to 40 degrees Celsius. I believe the intent of the method is to make sure that you run the extraction in room temperature. But of course, because of this requirement, the TPA asks us for the temperature record to make sure that during the 3-day extraction, the temperature did not exceed, beyond 20 to 40 degrees Celsius. But our argument is that, hey, the whole analysis is being run in a laboratory control setting. We always run air conditioning. It's always maintaining room temperature. But we didn't argue with them. We just tried to meet this requirement. So we just set up, I think, a digital thermometer with minimum and maximum setting. So we can display the minimum and maximum temperature after the 3 days of extractions, and then record it on the bench sheets. Number 7, the lab did not monitor the temperature on at least the top and bottom shelf of air incubators with multiple shelves in use. So standard method 9020B require to check and record corrected temperature twice daily on the shelf in use, or at least on top and bottom shelf to ensure consistency throughout the units. So in the treatment plant laboratory, the outlying laboratory only run 1 sample per day, but we happen to have 2 shelves into small incubators. So obviously, I don't think it's practical to monitor the temperature with 2 thermometers in such a small incubators. So the way we address this problem is just simply remove 1 shelf from the incubator. Number 8, medium performance testing and sterility checks were not performed by the individual lab using the materials. So TNI requires to demonstrate and document the quality of reagent and media for the test concern in each of the laboratory. So this is especially challenging for the outlying laboratory because they only run one micro sample per day or per week. So all of a sudden, you require them to meet all those verification requirements. Is really challenging with limited resources. Our previous practice is to centralize all those verification work at one of our main facility, and then we transfer those media to the outlying laboratory with district operated vehicle with environmental control. To be honest, I feel like we meet those requirements, but I believe we submit a standard interpretation request to T9 and got rejected. So we have to meet this requirement in all our outlying laboratories. Okay, challenges and opportunities. Implementing the 3 QMS requirements certainly presented numerous challenges. However, we were able to turn challenges into opportunities by thinking outside the box, getting out of the comfort zone, and taking advantage of technological advancements. But how do you motivate people to step out of the comfort zone and comply with the new requirement for 170 people? How can you gain buy-in, right, for organizational changes? So remember that we were accredited under a method-based accreditation for years, and now we're transitioning to a QMS-based accreditation. So that's why it's crucial to have an implementation plan that outlines progress and provides periodic updates to lab staff. We also conduct QA meetings on a monthly basis to keep everyone informed, provide guidance, even deliver presentation on various QMS topics. I mentioned earlier that we even conduct internal audit within our own group. Ensure that we adhere to the same QMS requirements. And also, before we implement any new TNI requirements, we collaborate with other lab groups to understand their operational and logistical challenges, ensure that comprehensive lab-wide policy and procedures. Also, most of our staff, QA staff here, have completed the T9 basic assessor training and participate in the TNI expert committee, either as an associate or voting members. I believe instead understanding TNI requirements from an assessor perspective is essential to effectively help lab implement TNI. So I'm not going to go over all the key details here, but there's a lot of resources you can find in the ELAP and TNI website. Just so you know that when TPA conduct on-site assessment, they will certainly use the California assessment checklist, which can be downloaded from the ELAB website for free. So this is a great way for you to prepare for third-party assessments. Next slide. Okay, in summary, I mentioned that we conduct a gap analysis using the T9 QMS checklist to assess our laboratory lab practices and procedures. We also developed a plan for implementing the new standard, which include a timeline, resources that are needed. We updated the quality manual 350 SOP and policy to the T9 format, so the lab can follow this procedure to implement the new standard. We utilize internal audits to ensure all lab groups comply with the new requirements. If you are uncertain about implementing the new standard, I would strongly recommend you to seek help from a consultant. We have had excellent experience collaborating with third-party assessors who possess extensive expertise and willingly share practical insight on how other laboratories implement TNI. So that's really beneficial for us to seek guidance. If you ask me how to implement TNI in 6 months, I will still adhere to the step outlined here. Interestingly, actually, I didn't I did not put together this summary. I was asking those AI, I think ChatGPT and Google Bard, 2 artificial intelligence chatbots, They both yield similar result when searching for ways to implement TNI in a 6-month time frame. Okay, next slide. So just quickly, I just want to acknowledge the support from my management team and the QA team. Without the dedication and hard work and support, I don't think we can achieve the early adopter of TNI in 3 years. So I greatly appreciate the support and help here. Next slide. So at last, I just want to conclude this presentation with our laboratory quality statement, which is also our TNI management requirements. The laboratory session supports the district's mission to protect public health and the environment by providing quality analytical services and technical expertise through commitments to professional development, continuous improvement, and relevant research guided by a culture of integrity and dedication to customer service. Okay, thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any question you may have. I just want to emphasize really quick that as a lab community, we are working together as a team with a shared goal of producing reliable and well-documented data of high quality. If you have any questions that I'm unable to answer today, please do not hesitate to reach out to me using the email address or phone number displayed on the screen. I don't even mind to give you a demonstration of any specific TNI requirements on how we fulfill those elements.
Great, thank you so much, Kelvin. And as we hoped and expected, we have lots of questions. So we're going to try and get through as many as we can. Were there any aha moments when you first started to implement TNI-2?
Yes, it was certainly a struggle because we were hit by all those challenges all at once, right? But as I mentioned, I really tried to start something small. Don't overload it with my staff, and I think coming up with an implementation timeline really helped, right? Just really give us a plan to how to move forward, and the pandemic somehow helped a little bit too, because people are forced to make changes, right? They change their lifestyle. All of a sudden, they are required to work from home, and those are unheard of before the pandemic. So we are able to kind of pick it back into those challenges and turn it into opportunities.
Awesome. And so a little bit more specific, is the document control software part of LIMS? And can you elaborate on how you give the documents a number or name, and if you have a separate front page for history?
Yes, so this is our open text DMS system is not part of our LIMS. It's actually managed by our IT team. So the way every time you upload a document into the system, is automatically assigned a new numerical number. So it's uniquely identified already, but oftentimes we change the title of the documents to make sure that it is differentiated between the two labs, because we share a lot of similar documents across all 10 labs. And what is the last part of the questions?
Do you have a front page with like a revision history or separate document that keeps track of that?
Yeah, so that's a click for you to look at the history of all the edits, view whether anyone can copy or delete the documents. So, and also majority of us have only read-only access, though they're not allowed to tamper with the QMS documents until approved by the supervisor.
With your preparation, did you hire any consultants?
As I mentioned, we schedule third-party assessment. They conduct pre-assessment with the two main lab and one outline laboratory. So they provide a lot of good recommendation for us, especially we already meet majority of the TNI requirements. So they kind of deep dive into our operations and look at our records and documents and provide some insightful information. So I strongly encourage you to reach out to the TPA for help.
What did you tell your executives to influence them to support you to implement TNI before 2024? And what things did you do to change the culture in your lab to support TNI?
I don't think I get a lot. Well, obviously, because it's part of the regulations, we have to comply with the new requirement regardless. So, but fortunately, we get a lot of support from upper management. They're able to give us additional resources. In QA, we did not hire additional people, but we were able to reclassify 2 technicians to professional so that we can manage different various QA program effectively. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
And how did you change the culture in your lab to support TNI?
So the culture, as I mentioned in the slide, then we try to keep everyone informed. I think the key is that you have to remain transparent, right? Whenever you make any changes in QA, then you have to let everyone know, give them a heads up. Okay, those are the changes. And whenever we update lab-wide policy and procedure, we actually send those SOP policy to management and supervisor for review, so they can look at the procedure themselves from their group perspective and provide a review on that. Then we will make some adjustment after reviewing the comments.
Do you have a policy for workstation organization, namely all required materials at hand without extraneous items?
I think we have some kind of master list to keep track of all the workstations and instruments and support equipment in an Excel form, and that gives us a way to keep track of whether we need to upgrade or conduct any maintenance on all those like support and instruments and workstations. I hope I answered that question.
Do you do document revisions more than once a year?
It depends. Our schedule is every 2 years, but oftentimes, like let's say that hey, we have to meet the 2021 method update rules, so all of a sudden we have to look at the 23rd edition of standard method outside of the 2-year review cycle. So it depends.
Okay. Let's see, who performed your QA team internal audit, or basically who audits you, your internal audits for your QA team, and what tools do those auditors use?
So just similar to how we conduct internal audits, but we know our operation better than anyone else, so we just perform internal audit on each other. So we look at our records, for example, document control, we control all the tier 2 documents. So we look to see whether we meet the document control requirements, the unique identifications. And then after we finish with our audit, and within 30 to 60 days, we submit a report to management. And they will ask questions, follow up with our responses as well.
Does your group centrally receive, inventory, and distribute all reagents and consumables to all of the lab locations?
Mostly, yes. So I manage the supply services group, which oversee 2 stock rooms in the 2 main labs. So we meet all those purchasing services and supply requirements by verifying the reagent and standard with the packing slip. So yes, but of course the lab themselves can order their own standard, but that means they have to meet the purchasing service and supply requirement themselves.
What is your suggestion for tracking and controlling instrument software?
What I do is I just incorporate into the SOP. So in the SOP, under the equipment section, we just say that, okay, for this instrument, we view software number so and so, and this is how we control that. And that seems to be satisfied with the TPA.
Right. How will you implement corrective action on the sterility check in individual lab location findings?
How do I address this? I think we just do it. I don't think we can get away with this. So we try to order reagents in a batch within the same lot, so we don't have to verify a micro supply very often. You know, we just somehow meet the requirements. But I think we're looking into consolidating the micro operation in the treatment plant laboratory, because it adds a lot of overhead to our operation in order to meet these requirements.
Are any of your documents generated by or found on a LIMS, like bench sheets, work lists, etc.? And how are these handled in document control?
So majority of the document is still saved in DMS. We do have some bench sheets saved in LIMS too. So we can upload the bench sheets, chain of custody, and attach to the shipping batch, receiving batch, or some of the analytical batches. So you can say that we utilize both DMS and LIMS to control documents and records.
Okay, I think we have time. I'm gonna one more question and then we're gonna move on. But just so you audience know, Kelvin and also Marie, one of Kelvin's staffers, is also on our Slack channel. So I'm sure they'll be happy to keep answering questions there. So last question right now is, did you hire any additional staff to meet current demand to maintain compliance?
As I mentioned before, we did not hire additional staff in QA, but in other groups, we do hire a search to implement this TNI because of all those administrative requirements.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Kelvin, for the great stories and your encouragement. We're so glad we were able to hear from you today. Our next two speakers probably could start their own fan club, and I would volunteer to be president. Kate Hilty and Chris Hand are names that I'm sure are familiar to most of you. They are both incredibly knowledgeable and experienced with all things ELAP. Since you heard from Chris Hand on day one, I won't reintroduce him. I'll just take a moment to highlight Kate. Kate Hilty joined ELAP in 2015 and is currently the manager of ELAP's Administrative Operations Unit. In addition to overseeing all administrative activities, Kate leads the program policy analysis, communications initiatives, and special projects. Kate spent 10 years honing her customer interaction skills in several arenas prior to joining the Water Board. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Government and Communication Studies and a Master of Arts in Public Policy and Administration, both from Cal State University, Sacramento. I will hand things over to you guys, Chris and Kate.
Good morning. Thank you, Jen, for that introduction. Hello to everybody. Happy ELAP Con 2023. Before I jump in, I want to just take a moment to recognize our amazing co-chairs, Jen, Kat, and Leanne, for all the work that they've done to put together this conference, as well as all of the amazing presenters who have taken their time to give us some great presentations this year. I hope everyone out there is enjoying our theme. We really love this event so much. It's a chance for us to get to have fun and to be a little bit silly and to be able to provide, resources to help everyone out here. Also wanted to let everyone know that Chris and I are typically manning the Q&A box. So during our presentation, we may be a little slow to get back to you, but we will catch up as soon as we're off. Okay, so this presentation is tips and tricks, things that Chris and I think are important for everyone to hear and to know to be ready for the TNI compliance date, January 1st, 2024. So I'm going to do the first part of the presentation and I'll be giving some tips related to ELAP and applications, and then I'm going to hand it over to Chris and he's going to focus on TNI tips and tricks. So our first tip, and you heard Chris Ryan talk about this on day one, but it's so very important that I wanted to highlight it as well. We are recommending that all of our in-state laboratories use the timeline guidance tool that we have posted on our main webpage. I want to give y'all a demo of how to find it because it is just that important. Sorry, I gotta share. Okay, so from the main ELAP webpage, what you'll do is just scroll down on the right-hand side, and then you'll see this pretty box right here with the timeline guidance tool. You click the link, and then what opens up is the tool. And I want to be really clear that what you need to put into this box here on the top to get the dates appropriate for your laboratory is the date that your certificate expires. We've had a few people put the date that their application was due, and I mean, that just puts them ahead of the game. But for this demo's sake, we're going to use, we'll use July 31st, 2024 for expiration date. So all you have to do is enter the date that your certificate expires and then click or tab into another box. And you'll see that all of these dates have self-populated. So the first section is about your on-site assessment timeframe. We're giving you the date that we would recommend you having that performed during. So it would be from the very beginning date on your new certificate all the way up until May of 2024. We also give you a recommendation for when you should reach out to a TPA and when the actual, or ELAP, excuse me, and when the assessment should occur. We do that recommendation because we want to build in some extra time for y'all, because these always take time. They never happen quite as fast as everyone hopes that they will. The next section down is proficiency testing timeframe. So you've got a date range again from when you can perform your PTs. The important thing is that the close date on the study falls between this range of dates, both for year 1 and year 2. Again, we're giving you a recommendation of when you should perform your PTs if possible. The next section down talks about your application due date, which would be May in this example, but we are recommending that you try to submit your application at least 2 weeks to 4 weeks ahead of time. The reason that we recommend this is because we still are getting quite a few applications that are not complete. And if you wait till the very last day and you submit an incomplete application, that's going to be deemed late. And you will be charged a late fee for that. So if you submit it a couple weeks early, that gives our administrative staff a chance to review your application and help you complete it if you've, forgotten to include an element. And then the bottom section is really useful. It's just additional guidance on OSAs and why we recommend planning so far ahead for them, because it can take 5 to 6 months to complete an OSA after it actually occurs. So that doesn't even build in the planning time. And if you look here, you can see why that's the case. So again, we recommend everybody use this tool. Even if you feel like you have a firm handle on what is required for your laboratory, this is just such an easy tool to use. It is so helpful. So please go to our main page and make use of this resource that we have available for everyone. Okay, our next tip is about third-party assessments. And the one thing that I always tell people when we talk about this is to reach out to more than one of our TPA firms and get quotes so that you can price shop, because the prices are not the same from firm to firm. And you can, potentially save your laboratory some money by getting multiple offers. We have all of the contact information for all of our TPAs posted on our ELAP assessments webpage. Again, you can get there from the main ELAP webpage, but this is a tip that I make sure to tell everybody because we want to be able to support you and make sure that you're getting the best deal that you can. My next tip is about ELAP assessments. So right now, ELAP is scheduling assessments in the month of June. That's next month. So you can see we have a pretty short lead time right now in ELAP. So if you've waited a little bit too long, that might be good news for you. But again, we don't recommend waiting. The tip that I want to make sure everybody knows is that you guys can schedule ahead of time with us. So if because you went and used your scheduling tool, that you want to have your assessment in July of next year, you can reach out to ELAP now, submit the assessment request form, and put your date preference, work out your date preference with our assessment unit so that you can get that on the calendar. I would highly recommend getting your dates calendared as soon as possible. I also wanted to mention we are performing TNI -2 assessments. All of the assessments will be to that standard after January 1st, but we are now doing that and have been doing that too. So feel free, for those of you that are able to use ELAP to perform your assessment, to request that. My next tip is about our YouTube channel. Some of you may not know that we have a YouTube channel that's really amazing. If you go to Google and you just type in California ELAP YouTube, it will be the top search result that comes up. And I just wanted to highlight this for everybody. When you get to the main California ELAP page, it will show you this whole long line of videos here. You'll see that we already have day 1 posted from the ELAP conference this year. What I wanted to show everyone is that if you click on this playlist tab, you'll see that we have playlists for both the ELAP Con and 21 and 22 that lines them up the way that the days the days and the presentations took place. And then we'll also have the TNI documentation workshop where all of the videos are lined up here. And you can go through them one by one. You can also jump around if you know, like there were a lot of questions on document control for Kelvin. So, if you want to go in and watch 4.3, that's the only thing that's important to you right now, or that's what you're working on in your laboratory, you can jump around. You can rewatch sections over and over. They're all split up to make it easy to use. But the playlist does have them in order of how the presentation and the training was given by A2LA. The next thing I wanted to mention is just how to ask us for clarification. So we get about 250 emails every month to our main ELAP box with just questions asking for help. Usually our response time is about 2 days unless you have a really complex question that takes us longer and more staff to answer. But we are available for help, and we like when you reach out to us with questions rather than, trying to figure out the answer on your own. We do still offer transition appointments for anybody who wants to sit down and have a longer discussion about your laboratory's compliance with us. We typically have 2 or 3 ELAP senior staff sit down on those appointments and just talk with you one-on-one and answer questions about your laboratory specifically. We do have on our Contact Us webpage, which is all the way at the very, very bottom of our main page, we have different email inboxes that will help you if you have specific questions. So the main box, everyone knows that one. You can send any question there, and we will get it to these other boxes if it's a question about PTs or something technical. But if you have a proficiency testing question, you can email the PT unit directly. Their email address is here. We also have technical questions. So if you have questions about TNI, if you have questions about instrumentation, questions about methods, emailing directly to the technical inbox is kind of just skipping the middleman. And then we have a comments inbox that we do use sometimes when we're asking for specific feedback on specific projects or initiatives that we're working on. Before I turn it over to Chris, I wanted to just take a minute to plug the survey that's going to be coming out. Judy talked about it in her presentation yesterday, but we are focusing on working with LTAC to make the application process as smooth and as least challenging for laboratories as possible. We have developed a survey. It will be a quick survey. It's not going to take much time for you to participate in it, but it'll be coming out soon by email to our listserv. We'll also post it on our main page. And I really want to ask everyone to participate because that survey will determine what LTAC focuses their time and resources on helping create solutions for. So, if there's the most amount of concern around the application forms and the instructions or, PTs, we will focus on the areas that the laboratory community tells us that they need the most help. So that is what I'm just wanted to take a minute while I have you all to plug that. Be on the lookout. It will be coming very, very soon. And with that, I think, yep, Chris, you're up.
Thanks so much, Kate. And welcome to the last day for those folks who are still joining. I do see that number of attendees changing constantly as the day moves on. I'm going to give tips mostly focused on the TNI portion. whereas Kate was mostly focusing on the application and making sure you meet all those regulatory requirements. So if you're not aware, all laboratories must be implementing T&I come January 1st, 2024. Doesn't matter when your application is due, doesn't matter when your certificate expires. This requirement is applicable to all laboratories as the ELAP regulation option sunsets on this date. What we are looking for to get that early adopter certificate of recognition and achievement is if you've had and completed a T&I based assessment. So you still have time, you still have 6 months this year to get a T&I based assessment and get an early adopter certificate. But if you don't, if you go to the next slide, if you don't get that assessment yet or haven't or aren't ready, prepare for a little bit of extra work come 2024. We're going to start off slow and be asking where you are in your compliance path. We are taking a light touch towards enforcement. We don't want to punish those laboratories who aren't quite there, but we want laboratories to be compliant. So keep in mind, if you haven't had your next assessment, do you know when that next one needs to be? Do you know who you're going to use? Do you have it scheduled already? That would be a good thing to keep in mind. ELAP might be asking you when your next assessment is going to be and if it's scheduled, and if so, who with. Your quality manual should be updated to be compliant at that point, come 2024. That's kind of an easy one that ELAP will probably ask for to review, to kind of gauge your process. You should have documentation showing that you've updated your quality manual. That could be your procedure review, that could be documentation of staff training. There's a lot of bits and pieces that your laboratory does that you probably have documented that could demonstrate that you are working towards compliance. But most importantly, respond to the email that ELAP sends you, because if we don't get a response, that's when ELAP might take some sort of enforcement action against you, right? We want to hear back from you. So if you have your you have staff changes recently, as we're seeing in a lot of laboratories nowadays, with people moving around, people moving up, people moving across, make sure that contact email at ELAP is correct. And if so, if you've had staff change, then make sure our records are up to date, so we send a contact email to the correct person. If we go to the next slide. For those who don't have one, you have to have a copy of the T&I standard in your laboratory. This isn't any different than having a copy of your reference methods like standard methods or ASTM. You got to have a license controlled copy come January 1st, 2024. If you are a T&I member laboratory, you get discounts on the standard and you get access to a bunch of guidance documents. I'll touch on those a little bit later. It's not a requirement. You don't have to be a T&I member if you don't want to be, but you do need to have that license copy. Next slide. For those who are members or have purchased the T&I standard, there is a quality systems checklist that you can download from their website. It's pretty good. It covers all of the quality system things that are needed. You know, you can use ELAP's training, free training and free templates and free tools that we have available. But you can use this for your internal audits, prep for your assessment, that kind of thing. It's a pretty great tool to have in your laboratory, and it's going to be the checklist that all the CPAs and ELAP are going to be using to verify that your quality system meets the requirements. Next slide. I do want to highlight the resources that are available. That's one of the reasons why ELAP chose the T&I standard, is because there are a lot of resources available. A lot of them are published directly by T&I that already exist. There's a bunch of on-demand training courses you can purchase that are video broadcast type recordings. They have SOP templates that you can purchase. They have a small laboratory handbook that you can purchase as well that kind of is focused more so on those tiny laboratories with few staff. and kind of giving some extra guidance and materials there. And if we go to the next slide, there's some more resources, which are the standard interpretations and published guidance. So a standard interpretation is the T&I committee voting on how a specific situation applies to the standard. So there, Kelvin touched on it a little bit, where he submitted a standard interpretation on do we need to verify all of the pieces in the laboratory that's running the analysis, right? And that's kind of one of those areas where the T&I committee it goes to the applicable module committee, and the module discusses it, and then it gets passed around through a various amount of committees and all of the state accreditation bodies that run T&I. So these are our neighbor states like Oregon and Utah, Florida. They all take a vote and say yay or nay. Does this interpretation meet the language of the standard, and does it apply in this situation? So this is another area that's great for if you have a kind of a question. I've received a couple through that technical inbox. They got forwarded to me kind of asking, hey, we have this situation and this laboratory already looked up the standard interpretations and said, hey, it says this. Is this applicable to my situation? And the answer is almost always yes. There might be a weird case that it doesn't apply, but they also have some guidance documents available. And these are specific to, one of them was the number of standards that you need for your calibration curve, where methods don't define them. And it has a bunch of guidance on what your laboratory can do to verify that that calibration curve meets the T&I standard and still meets the regulatory or the method requirement. So this is a great website to reach out or to scour for some guidance, additional guidance and implementation help in your laboratory. We go to the next slide. One thing I want to touch on is the technical manager and the quality manager. Quality manager is a requirement beginning on January 1st, 2024. If you don't have a quality manager defined in your laboratory, and if you don't have a staff member that does all of the things that are required in the regulatory section, it might be that you have small enough staff that your technical manager and quality manager can be the same person. It is dependent on your laboratory and how your laboratory decides how to define your laboratory structure and how you delegate your duties. But there's no prohibition for them being the same person. So for those people who have a tiny laboratory with 1 or 2 people, maybe that's an option for you. Go to the next slide. And the last tip I'm going to give you is to know who your clients are. That's part of the T&I standard, is you need to make sure that your data reports and things like that meet your client's needs. ELAP is your laboratory regulator. We don't write any monitoring results. We don't dictate when testing must be done or where it gets uploaded to, aside from drinking water. We don't make those requirements. Your client's regulator is the ultimate client, right? They're the person who uses that data to make decisions. So you need to know why your test is required. You can't just blindly accept a sample that you don't know where it came from and they say, I want microanalysis done on this, because each program that gets reported to might have different needs. The biggest example and the easiest one to point out to is wastewater and drinking water, right? Is it a finished drinking water source that you're only running presence absence, or is it a wastewater sample where you're enumerating? Those have different holding times, right? Those have different requirements. The data has to go to somebody different, and that regulator might have specific requirements like data reporting or data upload. They might allow for flagged data. They might reject all flagged data. That is the entity that's going to receive that data and make a decision based on it. And you need to know why that test is needed from your client and where that data is going, so that way your laboratory can treat it appropriately. We go to the next slide. that's going to be it. I've been answering questions in the chat while Kate has been presenting. I anticipate there's going to be a flood of questions here. There's always a little bit of the delay on ELAP here. And so I'm happy to take any more questions that you guys have.
All right, thanks, guys. And there's already a couple, so I'll just get started. What is the most common problem, either administrative or technical, that you find labs are making, and how do you help them avoid this problem in the future?
Well, I can take the admin one, and Chris, maybe you can do the biggest problem for the technical side. But I would say that the biggest problem is that labs are not planning ahead. So, I mean, and that can cause a number of problems, but that's really the cause, is that you're not thinking about your accreditation until, oh crap, it's time to think about my ELAP, application. And we certainly recognize that you all have so much important work that you do outside of just, the things that you need to do to maintain your laboratory accreditation, but it does require some planning to get your laboratory accredited without any major hiccups. So again, I'm going to just recommend that you use the planning tools that are available to you so that you're thinking about it well in advance.
For the technical side, I think the largest question that we often get is kind of, how do I keep track of competing requirements? And the answer to that is almost always, well, where is the data going? Who is your regulator? Right, so there's certain things that are defined in a federal register because that test is being used for a federal program. So things like holding times, sometimes they're defined in the method, sometimes they're defined in the federal register. So that federal register is the requirement for that specific program, right? There's a lot of entities that reference the CFR. Drinking water is one of them, wastewater is another, and that CFR sometimes has defined holding times that need to be met. So making sure that you know what program it's for will help kind of define it there. But my general guidance to those laboratories is almost always, what's the more stringent standard, right? What's the more difficult one to meet? Because if you're following that, you should be compliant with both, right? It doesn't matter at that point because you'll be meeting the most stringent criteria. But it does depend what your ultimate client is, what that regulated body is, and where that data is going.
Great. I'm going to pose to Kate. We've got several questions. So about turnaround time. So I know that it can be a little variable, but can you talk a little bit about turnaround times for renewals and like amendments for 10 to 20 FOAs and then amendments for the MUR? Like, what are things looking like right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I get into the specifics of those, one of the things I wanted to say is that we're working as part of our application improvement project that we're doing with LTAC. We're also working on some metrics that we are planning to display in a dashboard on our website, and turnaround times is absolutely going to be probably like the top line because that's everyone's most, primary concern. I can tell you that our average turnaround time on renewal applications is 52 days, I believe. And for amendments, it's 31 days. And I can't tell you specifically with the MUR amendment applications because we've only gotten maybe 2 of them at this point. So not enough data points to give you a good idea of how long that would take. But what I can tell you is that amendment applications tend to move faster than renewals. Any application that's complete is going to fly through our process. We do have kind of a prioritized amendment application process, and this is something that we identify when we're working with a laboratory and understanding why they're submitting an amendment. So, if you got denied something on your renewal and have to submit an amendment application to correct that, we internally work to call that and to work it through a prioritization process where we move it kind of to the top of the pile. And the average turnaround time on those applications is 10 days, although it can be much, much faster in those situations.
And then kind of a piggybacking on that one, can a lab submit an amendment application concurrent with a renewal application because of the TPA assessments?
Yep, absolutely. And I will also mention that you can use the same assessment report in your amendment and your renewal, assuming that that assessment covered both items. So it may those applications may look very, very similar when you're preparing them.
Thanks, Kate. I'm going to toss the next one over to Chris. How does California ELAP define a quality manager for a large lab? Is it the QA supervisor or the QA officer if the lab has one?
Well, that's kind of the perk of how it's defined. It's really up to your laboratory who you want to choose. So the quality manager has specific things that they are responsible for, and that's defined in the regulation. But in terms of how that is actually implemented in your laboratory, it's totally up to you. You can name them quality assurance officer, quality supervisor, doesn't really matter to ELAP. We just want to make sure that you have a person that's responsible for those duties.
And I'm going to ask you the next one too. Does the PM and calibration services of the lab testing and general equipment need to be provided by an ISO certified company?
It depends on what it is, but generally, yes. Just because you want to make sure that you're going back, you want that traceability, right? So it's the same kind of thing with your calibration standards. You know, make sure those are traceable back to a source that's verified and the concentration is known, that kind of thing. So depends on what it is, but usually yes.
I'm going to let you guys decide who answers this one. Can you explain what happens when a lab disagrees with the TPA finding and assessment? Is the dispute elevated to ELAP or what happens?
You want that, or I can take
Sure.
it, Chris?
I can do it.
Okay.
And it depends on what it is, but yes, generally they have their own internal process for how they handle disputes. We haven't really had many. I can't even recall one that we've had that wasn't resolved before the on-site assessment process was complete. But if there is still a dispute, come time that the assessment is complete, and you can certainly submit it to ELAP and say, hey, look, I think this assessor's totally out of line. And this is their response to our complaint. ELAP has the ultimate accreditation authority. We are the ones that make the decisions. It's not a decision made by the third-party assessor. They're making a recommendation for accreditation if you acceptably respond to all of the corrective actions, but that decision is still in ELAP's hands.
And I will add to that too, that this was a question we got a lot before the TPAs actually came and started working in California, and it really hasn't been a problem that we have had to deal with. One of the things that I've heard from laboratories is that TPAs are generally very good at having a conversation with you about your concerns related to an assessment finding. And, you know, if you guys in the course of conversation, you know, provide evidence to your point or something, like they go through a process internally and I know of circumstances where they have, you know, changed the finding based on some evidence that the laboratory provided. So I would just highly suggest, you know, approaching it from a standpoint of like, hey, I'm not understanding this finding. I don't know if I agree with it, and here's why. And then having that conversation with your assessor rather than coming to ELAP immediately, because I think generally it's always resolved in that first part of the process.
Great. I think we have time for just one more question. How do you resolve the challenge that a QM needs to be independent of the lab operation, especially for small labs?
Ooh, that's a good question.
To you, Chris.
Yeah, the standard requires there's no undue influence from either management or their responsibilities in the laboratory. I've seen laboratories who have two staff, and they have one technical manager and one quality manager, and they both kind of act as each other for whatever work the other one is doing. So one person's in charge of this area of the lab, the other person's in charge of this area of the lab, and they're the technical manager for each section that they're in charge of, and they're the quality manager for the other section. So that way you have a second person that's reviewing your laboratory, reviewing your procedures, that's not actually performing the procedures, if that makes sense.
Great. Thank you both so much. As they mentioned, they're the ones kind of moderating the Q&A chat box here. So if you have any other questions, they'll be happy to answer them there or over on Slack. At this time, we're going to take a quick break before we move on to hearing from all of our TPAs at warp speed. We have another fun poll for you today, too. If you're up for it, take a second to answer what your space vehicle preference is. Also, take a minute to grab some water, get a little fresh air, but not too much because we're going to be back in just 5 minutes. So we'll see you at 10:30. All right, I think that's all the time we have for a quick break. Looking at these poll results based on yesterday and today, most of you would rather be watching Star Wars while you're on the Enterprise. I think we're all a little confused. Personally, I would like to be traveling through space on the TARDIS because it's bigger on the inside. So you have lots of space, but you don't have to worry about intergalactic parking. I don't know. That's just me. All right. Our first TPA presenter is Zanetta Popovska of ANAB, or ANAB. Zanetta is the Associate Director of ANAB with the responsibility to lead the inspection, laboratory, and related activities team of testing laboratories, the proficiency testing providers, reference materials producers, and medical and biobanking. Zanetta has 12 years of experience with the ANAB ILR team and many years of prior professional engineering, medical research, and technical experience in various testing laboratories. Janetta has led many assessment teams and continues to represent ANAB as an executive committee member for ASIL, Environmental Sciences Section, and the T9 Lab Expert and QMS committees. Thank you for joining us, Janetta.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Jennifer, for that good introduction. So today I will tell you what really ANAB is doing to prepare for a good assessment. As you all know, as Jennifer mentioned, ANAB, the NC National Accreditation Board, we are one of the 4 approved ABs from California ELAP to perform assessments to environmental laboratories for California ELAP program. Next slide, please. There are 3 key takeaways that we need to understand so we're going to be able to perform a good assessment. First, we need to understand the activities that are necessary to prepare a good assessment. Second, we need to understand the importance of preparing our assessors. In turn, it's really to learn the tools for continual improvement. Next slide, please. And let's talk about the activities to prepare a good assessment. Next slide. We really need to define the assessment activities. We need to understand those what are those assessment activities, and what are those different assessment activities based on. So they can be based on the type of the assessment. We need to know what type of assessment we are performing. Are we doing the reassessment? We are doing scope expansion, or we are doing just simple follow-up corrective action visit. Also, we need to focus on the assessment. We need to know if this assessment was really the TNI -2 assessment, or we are performing the full TNI assessment, or just like we were doing California ELAP requirements only. Also, the assessment team assignments, we really need to know those, because we all know that when assessors are performing assessment, especially drinking water methods, those assessors, they need to have special qualifications. So some of them are qualified to perform, they have certificate for chemistry, some of them for micro. So all this is very important. And the sampling plans are also very important for us. We need to know if the laboratory has a lot of more technologies listed on the scope of accreditation, and if they have more methods with the same technology. So we need to know what exactly are we witnessing the same preparation method for multiple methods that are listed. So all these things we have to keep in consideration. Next slide, please. The leverage technology, that's also very important. That we need to know and understand prior to performing the assessment. Filing and sharing of the documents, especially for the assessor to get prepared prior to the assessment, that all goes to the share file that we're giving access to our laboratory to submit the documents to ANAB, so our assessors can prepare on time. All assessment records also, they have to be submitted. Some of the assessment records, they have to be submitted also through the share file, or maybe some of them assessor has to communicate through some of the remote or virtual platforms, WebEx or Microsoft Teams, so they can communicate and assessor can easily prepare prior to the assessment. Travel management is also very important because if we have, especially for the on-site assessments, this has to be all those travel arrangements, they need to get done and should be done through communication between the assessor and the laboratory. Next slide, please. Identify points of contact. That's also very important that we need to know, and needs to be defined, and we need to understand. ANAB is really very good when we are sending allocation letter to the customer. We always notify and mention who manages the accreditation for that particular lab, who manages the scheduling, who interfaces with the customer, who manages the submittal of the documentation, and who, of course, the main thing, who are the assessor for that upcoming assessment. There's a contact info from our assessors and email address and phone numbers. So the customer, in this case, the laboratory, communicates with our assessors to schedule the date for the assessment. And also, if the laboratory has technical questions, they can communicate with the accreditation manager for their lab. If they have questions regarding submittal of the documentations, all our coordinator names are listed on that allocation letter. Next slide, please. Define the responsibility. That's also very important step that we need to understand in order for us, for ANAB, to perform a good assessment. We all need to know the customer assessment team and the accreditation bodies, which is ANAB in this case, what are our responsibility? We all know that ANAB is really involved right at the beginning during the application when laboratory sends the application to ANAB, when they're sending the FOA tables, and then we need to make sure to allocate appropriate mandates for that allocation for that particular assessment. Also, ANAB is responsible to, like I mentioned earlier, to provide share file access to the laboratory to submit the documentation for the assessor to prepare for the assessment. And also ANAB, we are responsible to send the OSA report to the laboratory after assessor submits to ANAB. And at the end, also ANAB is responsible to send the whole package to the laboratories with the recommendation letter so they can use that whole package and apply to California ELAP. Assessment team responsibility is to, right after the allocation, when they get allocated, to review the documentation, to prepare for the assessment, and then communicate with the laboratory and request additional documents if it's needed, and go on site, do the assessment, review all the records and extra additional documents that were not submitted. Also, the assessors, lead assessor, along with the team assessor, if there's a team assessor for that particular assessment, they have to review the corrective action plans that are submitted by the laboratory, and then send the OSA report no later than 30 days from the closing meeting of that assessment to ANAB. ANAB will review that OSA report and will send it to the laboratory no later than 30 days from the closing meeting. Customer responsibility, that's the laboratory, as we all know, is to submit the, after they send the application to ANABs, along with their FOA tables, to let us know what type of test methods they're requesting for this assessment, upcoming assessment, and also to send us the scope if they previously have the California ELAP scope of accreditation. Their responsibility is also to submit the documentation to ANAB at ANAB share file, and help the assessor with their analysts to perform the methods so the assessor can do technical witnessing, witness the performance of the methods on site, provide some records that were not provided during the submittal of that documentation, and also after they receive the OSA report, 30 days, no later than 30 days, to submit their corrective action plans to ANAB. Next slide, please. The scheduling of assessments in advance is the very important activity for performance of a good assessment. We really, ANAB, we are always scheduling 4 to 6 months in advance. And the reason for that is really, as you can see here on the slide, the assessor availability, client availability, and of course, document request. We all know that assessors, as I mentioned earlier on my previous slides, assessors are not all assessors are qualified. For example, if we have drinking water methods, they not all have the drinking water certification. So we have to make sure we allocate the assessor that is qualified to perform that type of a drinking water, to assess that type of a drinking water method. We're going to, of course, use that assessor who has those qualifications, or if a laboratory has a micro methods listed, of course, we're going to choose assessor who has certification, EPA certification for micro drinking water. Also, very important, and that we need that time. We're going to need the time to pair those two assessors. Again, depends on their availability. Client availability is also very important because, like I said, sometimes some of the staff members from the laboratory, they can go on vacation. So all this needs to be planned ahead of time. So we can all have the laboratory and the assessors can have the time, both the time that both agree to do this, to perform this assessment. Documents request is also important because ANAB requires those documents submitted by the laboratories for our assessor to get prepared really 45 days prior to the assessment. So really all this, the three elements really affect and makes us to schedule this assessment 4 to 6 months prior to the assessment, on-site assessment. Next slide, please. Determining of the mandates, again, it's very important activities that we need to know and learn so we are able to perform good assessment. And really, how are we determining those mandates? It's really based on the scope, a few elements here listed on this slide. Scope of accreditation, very important. So if we have a scope of a lot of FOA tables or 50 pages, we can allocate that assessment, that assessor to perform that assessment with 2 days. Of course, we're going to need more days for to allocate for that assessment. Also, assessment activities planned. We need to know what type of assessment we are performing. Are we doing the reassessment or we're doing scope expansion? Of course, if we have a scope expansion, we're going to allocate less time. If we have a reassessment and a lot of test methods listed on the scope, so of course, we're going to allocate more mandates for our assessor to complete that assessment. Also, complexity of conformity assessment body, which is the laboratory, it's very important. How complex that is. For example, if we have a multi-site laboratories who has 6 sites and they have the same quality management system, of course, when we go on the first site, we'll need more mandates to perform that assessment because we're going to review the whole management system and we're going to witness all those methods. So if we go next to the other side, and if they have, can you go to the previous slide, please? Thank you. Next, thank you. And then we're going to do the management requirements. We'll review the management system, but we don't have to go line by line to that same SOP because those 2 laboratories have the same quality management system. So that means for that second laboratory, we don't need to allocate same amount of time what we did with the previous laboratory. So previous nonconformities is also very important to know what are the previous nonconformities, how many nonconformity laboratory has from the previous assessment, so we can allocate a sufficient time for assessor to review those in full implementation of those nonconformities. For example, if the laboratory had 30 nonconformities from the previous assessment, so of course, on this assessment, we're going to allocate additional, either half day or 1 day, depends how serious those nonconformities were. Assessment team members also is very important element to pay attention on, because if we have a large scope of accreditation, if laboratory has, for example, we need to allocate 9 days for that particular assessment, and we might do it with 3 assessors, 3 days on site, 3 plus 3 plus 3, or we can do it with 2 assessors, 4.5 and 4.5 days. So all these points really are important for determining of the mandates for the assessment on site. Next slide, please. Assessment activity plan, it's also very important activity for ANAB to make a good assessment at the end. So lead assessor is preparing the assessment plan and usually sends to the laboratories no later than 2 weeks prior to the assessment. So sending the assessment plans with sufficient information on it, when the opening meeting is going to be, when the closing meeting is going to be, and what type of methods and which methods are on which they are going to be assessed. It's very important. So that way it can save time for the laboratory and for the assessor. And also laboratory can plan each analyst to be, if availability of that analyst, maybe some of the analysts are not working that certain amount, certain time that lead assessor put it on the assessment plan. So they can do the adjustments, but again, the assessment plan is also very important to be sent to the customer if enough time previously, so the laboratory and both the assessor can get prepared for the assessment. Next slide, please. Preparing of the assessor, that's the second key element, key activity that it's very important for ANAB for successful assessment. Next slide, please. We really, as I mentioned earlier, we are requesting the documents to be submitted by the laboratory prior to the assessment at least 45 days. All this documentation are provided in our share file folder for our assessors to get prepared, and if additional documents are needed, they can request it. That, like I said, this allows our team to get prepared for the assessment and also to identify potential issues that might arise during the assessment. Having the management review internal audit uploaded in our share file so our assessor can review, give a good picture to the assessors and to get prepared what to expect at the laboratories when they go on site at the laboratory. Next slide, please. Communication with our assessors, it's very important. ANAB, the accreditation manager, all our staff members, we all have direct communication with our assessors through emails, phone calls, and of course, we are doing a lot of trainings. We also have, ANAB has web portal postings for our assessors. And also, like I said, assessors can communicate with the laboratory prior to the assessment, again, to make sure this assessment is going smoothly with no problems and issues. Next slide, please. Assessor training that ANAB is doing is very important, and we are doing it very often. This is based on updates to our processes, changes to our forms, updates to our standards, and of course, if there are any issues, we want to make sure assessors are aware of those issues. If there's something with a certain laboratory, or if we have some trends for non-conformities that are happening, or behavior issues with some of the laboratories that we previously had. So all these are really done during the training with our assessors. ANAB has trainings, face-to-face trainings with our assessors once a year during our assessor development week. But we also do have quarterly meetings and we keep updates. We are updating our assessors if there are any issues, any trends, and like I said, any changes to the forms updates. Next slide, please. So the third key element that helped a lot for the successful assessment are the tools for continual improvement. Next slide, please. Client surveys. ANAB is doing the client surveys right after each assessment. Right after we complete the assessment for every laboratory, ANAB, our coordinators are sending the feedback. They're sending link to the customer after the assessment, and they can complete this survey to us. Again, this survey can be anonymous, and if there are any issues, they can put those issues and If there's any negative feedback, we are communicating with our assessors right away. So we wanted to address those issues. And again, we are using those as a training for improvement for our assessors and the whole staff members at ENAB. Our results, positive or negative, are shared with our assessors. We're doing this, like I've mentioned it, to our process. This helps for our process improvement, and we are sharing this during our assessor development week and through our meetings that we have during the year, all year round. Next slide, please. And also another tool, another key point that we're doing that is helping us for improvement is our assessor feedback. We always have, we value our assessors' feedback. For example, were sufficient man-days allowed for this particular assessment when after they're done with the assessment? Maybe next year, following year, we need to allocate more time. Was the laboratory prepared for that particular assessment? Also, if those documents provided prior to the assessment are really reflecting the actual practice or for the laboratory, or what other improvements could ENAB do so we can improve and make it better for the next assessment? Thank you. And I think I'm ready for the questions.
All right, we're a little short on time, so I think we'll just stick with one question. I think that'll be kind of broadly applicable. Can we have a renewal assessment and a scope expansion assessment completed with one assessment?
Renewal, of course, yes, that can be done. Yes, laboratory can do scope expansion and the renewal at the same time.
Okay, maybe I'll squeeze in one more.
Sure, no problem.
What if we don't have all the documentation that you request?
Well, yes, documentation has to be submitted to ENAB, and depends what type of documentation we are looking for. If laboratory, for example, they start to working on, I can understand LODs, LOQs, and that takes a lot of time for laboratory to complete, but we all need those. And if, for example, they're planning to complete probably 10 days after the assessment is done, so maybe we can write a non-compliance and laboratory can submit as part of that non-compliance and we can accept that. So again, we need to communicate. That's why we have the contact point of context. That's a technical question. Laboratory can communicate with the accreditation manager and we'll give them direct answer.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Janetta, for all that helpful information. Next, we're going to hear from Stephanie Rivian of A2LA. Stephanie is the Environmental Programs Manager with A2LA and has worked with the association since July of 2016. She supports the day-to-day operations of accreditation by assisting laboratories in obtaining and maintaining accreditation in the chemical, biological, and environmental fields of testing. Stephanie serves as the primary staff point contact for laboratories looking to participate in the environmental accreditation programs offered by A2LA, which includes the Department of Defense Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, the Department of Energy Consolidated Audit Program, TNI, and the State Environmental Laboratory Assessment Programs. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you, Jennifer. I hope everyone can hear me. Good morning. As she mentioned, I am the Environmental Program Manager at A2LA. I was asked to speak on performing root cause analysis and corrective action plan development, which we at A2LA feel is a very important process to both understand and implement in order to continually improve your laboratory or organization. Typically, we would spend a few hours discussing these topics, but today we're going to just kind of walk through this in more of a crash course kind of format. Next slide. So I will be discussing the current regulations in place, root cause analyses, what they are, how you would perform one, and then discuss how to use the root cause analysis in order to respond to assessment findings. Included in this presentation are multiple examples of ways to accomplish an effective root cause analysis and an example of a corrective action plan response to show how these are correlated. Next slide. So for those that are not familiar, A2LA is a nonprofit, non-governmental third-party accreditation body. We offer both accreditation and assessment services to testing and calibration laboratories, sampling organizations, PT providers, reference material producers, product certifiers, and plenty more.
Currently, A2LA accredits over 4,200 certificates and works with over 300 state environmental laboratories across the U.S. A2LA is recognized by the Florida Department of Health, the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, the Minnesota Department of Health, New Hampshire, and the California Water Boards to provide assessments on behalf of their programs. All of these states have regulations for participant labs to implement the requirements found in the 2016 TNI standard. Next slide, please. Okay. With the more recent adoption of the 2016 TNI standard requirements, California regulations note that labs shall now comply with the quality system requirements in accordance with Volume 1. So let's take a look at what the regulations say in Volume 1 related to corrective actions and root cause analysis. So Section 411 of the TNI Standard Volume 1, Module 2, which is for quality system requirements, states that the lab shall have a policy and a procedure for implementing corrective action when non-conforming work or departures from the policies and procedures in the management system or technical operations have been identified. The procedure for corrective action must start with an investigation to determine the root cause or causes of the problem. The root cause is a factor or could be multiple factors that caused a problem or a nonconformance. It's the core issue or the highest level cause. These should be permanently eliminated through process improvement in your laboratory. And a nonconformance can be identified in many different ways, such as an internal or an external audit, a management review, through staff observation or complaints. And each one should be taken seriously. It should be thoroughly reviewed, discussed, and records of these actions must be maintained. Okay, next slide. So root cause analysis is then the process of determining the cause to prevent future recurrence. If anyone has had a repeat deficiency, then this is something you would certainly want to spend significant time on in order to delineate the true underlying reason a particular problem keeps recurring. Making correction addresses the immediate symptoms, but may not always be the permanent solution. Sometimes when problems arise, taking immediate action and correcting the issue is pertinent, but you then have to go back and address how and why that happened. So the TNI standard also notes that a root cause analysis applies to systematic issues. So we're going to go into what a systematic versus a random issue is and when you have to perform a root cause. So systematic failure is one that is both predictable and reproducible. This is not a random issue. A systematic issue will consistently affect things in the same manner. So with that said, I always like to include this cartoon when I talk about random error, as I do challenge labs to consider how you would determine something was truly random without analyzing the potential causes. So the steps to determining the root cause. First, you want to identify the nonconformance or the problem. You want to establish potential causes that led to this issue. And then you want to investigate and evaluate. You really want to get as many people involved as you can to collaborate and brainstorm. This may not always be personnel that are directly impacted or had a hand in the issue. Getting eyes outside of the small bubble that may encompass this is a great way of truly delineating issues that may be affecting things that you may not have considered in the past. So you really want to expand the investigation, also past the single point issue. Has this happened before? Could it happen again? And does the issue apply to other areas of the organization or other methods performed? You want to keep records of the investigation, and then you're going to be able to use all of this information to then identify the root cause or root causes of the issue. Okay, so there's a few ways to go about root cause analysis and to model this for your documentation purposes. So we'll go through a few of these. There's a lot of other ways to do this outside of what I'll show you today, and the labs have the ability to create their own way to work through a root cause analysis. You just want to make sure that you're diving deep enough to really get to the heart of the issue. So first I want to go through the fishbone diagram, or as many have seen this before, as a 6M. The only difference is instead of environment and people, you would have Mother Nature and man, which are human inputs. So this is kind of a cause and effect type diagram, which allows visualization of multiple possible causes and the relationships between these variables to identify the true root cause or the major issue leading to the problem. So here you would want to identify the issue, brainstorm causes, as I mentioned, document this to determine the relationship and further investigate as needed. So this is just an example. Materials and reagents and standards, you're looking at incorrect degradation, certificates of analysis, the people, the training, verbal miscommunications, lack of communication, staff changed mid-project. There's a lot of turnover within the labs nowadays. When you're looking at machines and equipment, are they defective? Were they not maintained or calibrated appropriately? Were they overloaded? Looking at procedural or method-based issues, SOPs, work instructions, MURs, are they being implemented? When it comes to measurement, you're looking at calibrations, balances, thermometers, those type of variables. And then environment, we're looking at temperature, humidity, and work area. Okay. So moving into this just kind of further shows what we're talking about as we discuss materials. You're going to want to look at COAs, expiration dates and prep records, for methods, were the SOPs defined and clear? Oh, you can go back one. There you go. Is the version in use up to date? In terms of machines, checking your instrument functionality, parts, etc., looking at logbooks and maintenance records. For measurements, your calibration program, your equipment records, calibration records, as I mentioned, pipettes, thermometers, balances, and then environment, and then people. Were the people adequately trained? Are proper techniques being employed? That has a huge bearing when you're talking about analytical processes. Even with the way people hold and take care of pipettes can ultimately change the output. So it's something to pay attention to. All right, so next slide. So this is just an example. There's multiple examples as we look at failed QC. So your problem is identified, your QC failed low. So what could be some variables? Well, you looked at materials and you noticed that your standards that were used were expired. So maybe COA should be made more readily available. In terms of methods, your SOP update needed to include a check of standard or expiration prior to prep. The people need to be retrained to ensure appropriate standards are used. So with this, you can see that you checked the machines and everything was checked. Instrument functionality was there, maintenance records were up to date. In terms of measurements, your calibration records were sound, and in terms of environment, there was nothing noted that may affect anything. So these were the three areas in this example that were identified as maybe having issue. So here you can see it's not one root cause, it was multiple root causes that are all slightly related to one another. Okay, next slide. Alternatively, in another situation where you failed QC low, those same items might not be the issue. In this situation or this example, from review of the machines and from the environment, you notice that humidity fluctuations in the lab during summer were noticed when the hood vents were in use. So maybe you need to contact your HVAC and hood vendors. In response to that, it was throwing your controls off. So from review of control charts, you showed an annual trend during the summers. So maybe relocating the equipment was the response, or maybe an adequate response in order to suit the situation. Okay. So then the next technique that we're going to discuss is the 5 whys. You may have seen this quite a bit. This is a pretty common technique that I've seen employed in many labs. It's helpful in tracing the chain of events and determining the relationship between causes, starting with the nonconformance and kind of working backwards. This does not require advanced statistical tools and is a simple technique for not overly complex problems. Unlike the fishbone diagram, this may not always account for multiple contributing factors if overly simplified. Not everyone uses 5 whys. Some labs use 3, some labs use 7 to 10. The common middle ground is 5. So that's what we'll use moving forward. So here's an example of how to employ the 5 whys technique. So for this nonconformance example, the analyst was not performing step C as required by EPA method X. Next slide. So the first why is always, why did the nonconformance happen? So why was the analyst not performing step C as required by the EPA method? And the first why that we delineated was the analyst was not trained to perform step C. So why was that? The trainer was not aware of the EPA method requirement. Why? The requirement was not part of the lab SOP. And why was this? Was because the method update was overlooked during periodic SOP review. So why did that happen? And the final root cause delineated was a process is not set up to notify applicable personnel when method updates occur. So from this, you can see that there was a number of items that contributed to the original nonconformance. So even though it was very easy to say, oh, we didn't know that that was a requirement, or this was overlooked, or the analyst was unaware, the true issue was really that a defined process had not been set up to adequately notify those applicable personnel when that update occurred to then update the SOP and train staff appropriately to avoid the situation. So with this, I would then apply this to all the other methods that I was running in-house and ensure that all the methods were updated accordingly, and that this doesn't impact other areas of my laboratory outside of this single point issue. Okay. So the next example has to do with more of equipment. The nonconformance here is the autoclave mechanical timing device was not checked quarterly against a stopwatch. So this is a very specific requirement to the TNI standard. Okay, next slide. So why did this not occur? And that was that the lab accepted annual maintenance as sufficient, which only included pressure and temperature checks. And the reason for this was that the autoclave timing device is not listed in the equipment log, which triggers required maintenance at specific intervals. The lab determined that this is because the requirement was also not included in the equipment maintenance program or the SOP, because the lab was unaware of this requirement. So why was the lab unaware of this requirement? They chose to come up with that applicable personnel require additional training on the 2016 TNI standard requirements. So you can see that there can be a multitude of different responses. People can see things different ways, and really getting multiple people involved can give you a broader sense or a broader idea of how to correct an issue that may not be a random issue, but more of a systematic issue. Okay. So the last technique that I'm going to discuss today is a little bit more hierarching. This is the use of affinity diagrams. These are good for larger, more complex issues. You'll see this more at the corporate level structure for larger lab groups, and they're used for group collaboration efforts or when consensus may be needed. So first with this, you're going to write down potential causes individually. Then you're going to group up similar ideas and organize visually. Then you'll discuss and analyze trends based on the categorization or designation assigned. Okay. So this is just an example of a way to categorize issues. This is very brief, short kind of consensus. So if you wanted to look at things in terms of quality versus training versus equipment issues, you may be able to group it this way. So under quality, you may group things such as procedure updates, work instructions, secondary record reviews. Under training, you may look more so at instrument software techniques and usage, your IDOCs or continuing DOCs, analytical technique, data analysis, especially if you're doing manual integration. In terms of equipment, you could look at adequate instrumentation. Can your instrument achieve the detection limits that are required by the methods? Is it outdated? Do you need to find new parts for your equipment? Also look at your calibration program and maintenance. Okay. So how do root cause analysis relate to corrective action plans, and what is the requirement for California ELAP participant labs in terms of responding to assessment findings? So within 30 days of your lab receiving the assessment report from your third-party assessor or California ELAP, the findings will be identified in that report. So within 30 days, a corrective action plan must be submitted back to that TPA or to California. Your CAP must include a root cause analysis of the findings identified, the corrective actions that will take place to address the issues, and the date by which the findings will be corrected in-house. Okay. With that, the lab's response must be detailed, concrete, specific. We must be able to easily understand what is happening, what your lab is doing to correct the issue. You need to tell us how the corrective action is going to be implemented. If you're updating a quality manual or you're updating procedures or work instructions, we need to know the location and the summary of the change. We also need to see that you've included provisions for training and provisions for follow-up to ensure effectiveness of those changes. That is a big thing, the provisions for training. Whenever you're updating an SOP or a quality manual, when we say provisions for training, this could be just simply making them aware of the changes. It may be something that you're already doing in-house, but it wasn't properly documented. This isn't saying that you have to go through a full formal 1-hour training every time you update a document, but there has to be something in place to make those applicable personnel aware of the changes that were made and why. Then you're also going to want to include a proposed date of completion for each finding and include the name of the personnel responsible for completing those corrective actions. Okay, so the next slide, nope, you can go to the next slide. So the next slide, we're going to go back to the original one of the nonconformance examples, and I'm going to show you an example of how to use your root cause analysis to then develop your corrective action plan for submission in response to an assessment finding. So going back to this nonconformance, the analyst was not performing step C as required by EPA method X. Okay, next slide. We already went through our root cause analysis. We did our investigation, and these are the steps, these are the issues that we found from this investigation. So we can use this to then develop our corrective action plan. So on the next slide, so taking all those points and kind of creating it into one, the overall root cause would then be a process was not set up to notify applicable personnel when EPA method updates occurred to update the applicable lab SOP for dissemination to the analyst for review and training. So the corrective action here, first we include the approver or the responsible party. And then we're going to list the corrective actions that we are going to implement in our lab for this. So first I said that we're going to set up a monitoring process so that the technical managers receive notification when standard methods are updated. And this is going to be complete by July 1. The document review SOP 123 section 6 will be updated to include this monitoring process to ensure technical SOPs are updated as needed. Applicable staff will be trained on the monitoring and document review processes, and this will be complete by August 1. So this is saying we're going to work on the document review SOP, we're going to work on setting up a process, and then we're going to train staff and ensure that this is moving forward, effective moving forward. Then we're going to review all technical SOPs to ensure that they're adequate. And then we're going to perform a non-conforming work analysis to determine the potential impact on results previously reported. Since we weren't following a step that is required by the EPA method, we need to determine the potential impact. We need to see how that has possibly affected the results that we provided to our clients in the past. And then effectiveness will be reviewed at the next lab manager meeting, and this will be complete September 1. So we want to see that things are happening in a timely manner. We don't want to see things pushed out 9 months to a year if it's not necessary. So we want to see that things are moving in a timely manner. We want to see that you've considered all the things necessary to fix the situation and to prevent any type of repeat deficiency in the lab moving forward. Okay. So with that, this is our contact information. If you do want to reach out to us and have any questions outside of this, please feel free.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. We're a little short on time. So if you want to contact Stephanie either through the information on her slide, or if she wants to join us on Slack, I'm sure she'll be happy to answer questions there as well. Next up, we have Matthew Sika from PJLA. Matthew has over 30 years of experience in laboratory environments and has gained expertise in management and quality systems, laboratory accreditation, project management, process improvement, and regulatory issues. He has managed laboratories performing environmental testing and industrial hygiene. Having been a consultant, he understands the balance between the detail of the standard and practical application of the requirements with the focus of standard compliance in an efficient manner. With Perry Johnson Laboratory Accreditation, he serves in the role of Technical Program Manager. Please welcome Matthew.
And can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you for the introduction. So today we're really going to focus on some of the common T&I related findings. Seeing this through a different set of eyes, having been involved with various states' rollouts to the TPAs from state entities running programs, it's a hurdle, to be honest, because sometimes there's a lack of really good interpretation. The one thing I want to say about California is they actually engage the TPAs, so they have a much better understanding of the requirements through all the various trainings that's been going on. So that does give you as the laboratories a leg up on applying the standard and not just trusting how 3 people interpreted the requirements for many years. Next slide, please. So this is just the shameless plug. Perry Johnson is a cross-sector accreditation body. We work in the areas of testing, calibration, and medical laboratories. We also do audits and accreditation for inspection bodies, reference material producers, and PT providers. We work in very many different government and industry schemes, including Department of Defense, various state programs. Next slide, please. So to simplify this, there's really 3 types of issues that get observed. Documentation issues, the documents don't meet or state or clarify the standard requirements, or the method requirements themselves. You have record issues, and that can range from we're not recording things that provide that historical reconstruction. There might be traceability issues. There may also be record issues in terms of the amount of detail, or they just don't fill out the form. A lot of blanks. I've seen a lot of blank forms out there where certain elements aren't covered. The biggest one is really the implementation issue. Often what we see here is, well, your SOP may say one thing, but it isn't done in the laboratory that way. And the other implementation issue may be a more general issue where your procedures and application of the procedure really doesn't meet the requirement of the standard or the method. So those are you'll see that interspersed through the next 10 slides or so, speaking about the standard requirements that have common issues related to them. So we all know why we're here. There's approximately 19 references in your regs related to the T&I standard, focused on the quality system requirements, personnel and PT requirements with some exceptions, the lab facilities and equipment, and then notification, reporting, and control of records. And it's really important to understand that, 19 references in regulation may not seem a lot, but when you have a, roughly 40-page standard of requirements, that is a big plan of attack for implementing. So I do urge, think and start working early towards implementation, because if not, 2 weeks before an assessment, it's not going to go well for you at all. Next slide, please. So these, first of all, these findings aren't in any particular order. It's really dependent on the laboratory. The last couple slides are the more common issues, but these are always common findings, especially the first rollouts of this standard, because there is so much detail required. So first one is related to the internal audits. First one that I see is often that the laboratories don't do a complete internal audit. It really does need to address both the management system and the technical requirements. And often the focus is on the technical application of the standard, which is great, but you still need to understand that the audit still should be looking at document control, contract review, subcontracting, and those types of elements. The other thing that I see is that there's three real parts to internal audit that you need to look at. One, predetermined schedule and procedure. Without that, that's already a nonconformity. Often, we're also looking for some training around the qualified individuals to do the internal audit. The last part is that the standard T&I requires that the internal audit is completed annually. So that's another big issue, that there's not a complete internal audit done in that annual time frame. So this is one that you want to pay attention to when you're doing your internal audit before the TPA show up. Make sure you've gone through from your document control from clause 4.3 all the way through 4.16. You've covered those, and then look at the clause 5 requirements and make sure that they're met. Next slide, please. Measurement traceability. And the most common issue here is that unbroken chain of comparisons. And for the most part, it's the written record doesn't necessarily always support traceability, where there might be fragmented records. You may have records for your certified reference materials in LIMS, but I can't trace those particular standards' use throughout the development of the calibration curve, and then linkable to the results. If you don't have that, you already have a broken chain of comparisons, and that's where the biggest issue is in terms of measurement traceability. We all understand that we should be using CRMs, and we do use those in general. It's the challenge is when we don't see the standards prep linkable throughout the entire system. So that this is one that it might be multiple worksheets that build that chain, but the assessor needs to be able to really follow that chain throughout those various notebooks. So just pay attention to this one, because this is one that people say, well, it's a technicality, but isn't all regulation technicality? So it's really important to just pay attention and really document this one well. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next one that you see often is the review of requests, tenders, and contracts. Well, this one often is different for different types of laboratories. If you have a capture lab in a wastewater or drinking water facility, your chain of custody might be the only term of a quote unquote contract, because it says what the analysis is needed and you just apply it. You have the history of the site, you know where you're going from, you know what analysis to do. For a commercial lab, this might be different. You might have a formal contract. You may have a walk-in chain of custodies. And this is where typically there's some issues is the chain of custodies may or may not be considered contract, especially in the larger facilities where, well, we always collect these samples. This is our routine. That becomes really your point of your contract review. And when things aren't done per that sampling, that creates the challenges. So pay attention and think in terms of your chain of custody as a form of contract. It'll make that, it will help you understand the contract requirement a little bit clearer. Next slide, please. Next one is related to the management reviews themselves. Now, I always call the management review is where quality meets money. This isn't the rank and file meeting to discuss these issues. The management review is really meant for the management team of the lab reporting to upper management on the various issues, suitability of policies, procedures, reports from the managers and supervisors, corrective actions or preventive actions, all of those other elements. It is not part of the internal audit. And I see this often over time where management review and internal audit are all merged together as one thing. Well, part of the management review requires the outcomes of the recent internal audits being reported. So right there, they're two separate activities. Other things I have seen are that management reviews aren't just done or they have minimal records. There should be some reports in there from the management and personnel of the lab, supervisory personnel of the lab. This might be about sample flow, how many samples are there, if there's need for equipment. These should really have a little bit of beef to them and not just, oh, well, we met this day, discussed these 10 items, we're good. The other issue that's often found with the management reviews are there might be action items that come out of them and they may be recorded, but the challenge is often those actions are not followed through to the next year. So it's really is a challenge to sometimes link that all the way back. So I see a question just came up on what are CRMs. Those are certified reference materials. Those are your standards that you purchase from a 17034 accredited source. Next slide, please. So that the next one is related to personnel. And it really comes down to the records of the demonstrations of capability. These might be incomplete. A lot of times we see that job descriptions are not up to date. Other challenges that I've seen for laboratories is understanding what an authorization is. The standard has several key activities that need authorization, as well as, you know, the demonstrations of capability can support the technical authorization that somebody can do that method, but there's also other authorizations required in the standard. Many times we don't even see those defined or implemented in the system. They're just kind of ignored. So that's one to pay attention to. The next one really is about equipment and incomplete records. That's a common one. Software is a big one that people miss recording their software and having that documented as part of the equipment. Other issues I've seen throughout doing assessments to these types of standards, verifications are not performed at the required frequencies. and the same goes for calibrations. Sometimes it's not because the standard. And this is one that sometimes I find that there's what I call self-inflicted wounds, where in good faith you say, hey, we're going to do the verification of this pipette every 2 weeks because it's so important, and you don't. So you're right, you're gaining, eventually you're going to get your own findings written on how you apply your requirements. So you want to be careful with that. Next common finding is that the clause 4 itself, the management system requirements, are not completely implemented, or there's a big disconnect between what is actually going on in the laboratory and the standard requirement. Now, I realized, especially with the governmental or quasi-governmental organizations, purchasing is sometimes way out of the realm of your job, but there are standard requirements that purchasing needs some sort of technical review, and that needs to be documented. That needs to be clear in your management system. So that's one that is normally one of the issues, is purchasing of services and supplies, but there's others that can apply here. And then the other item that we see, can you go back, please? The other item is see that the requirements for the procedures are not met. Basically, it's just a regurgitation of the standard requirement. We do this, this, and this, with no explanation on how it gets done. What's that process? And so sometimes you really want to be, have a little bit more detail in there and not just, repeat what a cogent restatement of the standard. Next slide, please. Document control. And I know this was brought up in our first presentation of the day. Sometimes you see obsolete documents still in use. And sometimes it's the utter surprise of the management when they're following the assessor doing the assessment, where somebody pulls out a version of a document 5 years old with a bunch of updated notes on it. That's not a controlled document. Another common observation and finding related to document control are people have that bad habit of posting Post-it notes with instructions on them. And the challenge is those aren't really approved by the management to use. And think in terms of document control, especially on the technical side. Does the SOP meet the requirements of the reference method, and does that meet the intent of the standard? If you can tie it together, that will bring you great success in the long run. But again, it's one of those things that you really need to follow up on. And really, this is where the biggest challenge is with transition from a non-TNI, non-standard system, is always the document control. Other issues are, in good faith, you say, hey, we're going to review these annually, and it doesn't happen. So that's another one of those self-inflicted wounds. Be careful on what you state as a review frequency. If the standard doesn't state a specific one, do something that's reasonable. The other issue related to document control is that external documents are not considered. Your equipment manuals, any manufacturer instructions, those are externally controlled documents. You need to have at least a log of those where they're in use in the laboratory, because those are still part of your management system. Next slide, please. The next common finding is related to the SOPs. TNI is very prescriptive when it comes to the requirements of SOPs. There's the 23 or so standard require elements. Well, it's okay to take a section and say, see section 5 of the quality manual, but just don't chop it out of the SOP so it looks like it's not addressed at all. We can, if you create the roadmap, we'll be able to figure it out as assessors. But if not, we're kind of grasping around. The other issue that we see commonly with SOPs are that they don't reflect the current practice of the laboratory. This is important to really consider as part of your internal audit, is to get in there and witness some technical activities. Don't just say, hey, we do data review every day. That's the best internal audit there can be. The records only speak for themselves so much. You do need to actually get into the lab to see, are they really following the procedure as written? The other common issue with the SOPs, and this one can be a myriad of findings. A lot of times this is one that might have 5 or 10 sub-citations to it. The SOPs don't reflect the requirement of the reference method. And that's, QC is often one. If there's a specified calibration, if you're looking at ICP method and go, hey, when do we do our linearity check? Have we done a linearity verification? Those things we look at as assessors. So if it's quality related, we're going to find an issue. So really go through your SOPs and make sure that your SOPs are addressing the reference methods themselves. And this is even a bigger challenge in micro if you're doing standard methods, because there's a lot of sub details in that opening chapter of the micro section, and those get applied to all the standard method micro methods. So you can't just ignore the QC. It's part of that compendium. It's part of the method. So take your time and really, when you're building your system, follow the cross-reference trail. It's probably the best advice I can give, and that's with both the standard, the regulation, and then the reference methods. If you can find those requirements in your own documentation, that'll help make you bulletproof. Next slide, please. And then this one probably is the common number one finding, is the control of records. Cannot facilitate historical reconstruction of data. And that means we can't identify, there's multiple pieces of equipment. We can't identify which one was used. The intent here is, think of it in this term, that you would be able to redo this work using the same equipment, the same reference materials, the same pipettes, that anything that had a calibration through that whole chain. So remember, in terms of reconstruction, what you should have in there, and it's always focused on that technical element. Other issues are incomplete records. It's the blank line syndrome. If you created a form and it's empty, well, was it actually done? So remember, say what you do what you say, and take a good record of it. Right? Crossouts and obliterations are still a common issue. Illegible records, they shouldn't read like they're ancient Greek documents. And then again, think in terms of that traceability. And this is both the measurement, metrologic traceability, as well as that reconstruction element. That's really important. Next slide. And that's our contact information. And feel free to shoot me an email if you have any other further questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. We are still a little bit short on time, so if we have questions, we can either email them to him directly or see if we can get him on Slack. Our final presenters for the morning are Duncan Millar and Harry Makem of IAS. Duncan is the head of global sales for the International Accreditation Service. He has degrees from the University of California, San Diego and the University of Glasgow, Scotland. Duncan has led IAS efforts in working with laboratories transitioning to the TNI-2 standard for the state of California ELAP program. Harry Makem serves as the Accreditation Program Officer at IAS. He has his BS in Forensic Science from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He is also an EPA Microbiology Lab Certification Officer and has performed numerous assessments on testing laboratories against the ISO IEC 17025 standard. Go ahead and take it away, Duncan and Harry.
Great. Good morning. Thank you for the nice introduction, and welcome everybody to this presentation. I know it's coming up on lunchtime, so Harry and I will make this efficient and as possible. My job with the organization is to connect all the smart people. Harry would be one of those on our side, and then all the people at the laboratory side will complete that connection. So I'll be introducing a couple of concepts about IAS and then handing over the microphone to Harry. So on the next slide, you will see both of us. Harry looks like he's about a 250-pound linebacker in that photo. I know he's lean and mean and svelte, but those are your two hosts. We're delighted to have Harry working in our program, both for doing assessments, and also he has the qualifications for EPA certification for drinking water for the bio with the EPA. At a glance, most of you know this from our monthly webinars. We're, of course, a proud non-governmental accreditation body, a TNI recognized. I've been working with the state of California since middle of 2020 for this program. We're the only non-governmental accreditation body based in California, which gives us some inherent advantage, and mostly it kind of cements our relationship with the laboratories in California, because this is where we live and work. So you can see all of our signatory partnerships and agreements with the various entities. On a side note, the Asia Pacific Accreditation Cooperation, together with our friends over at A2LA and Per Johnson and ANAB, we're hosting this down in Southern California in a few weeks in Anaheim. I know some of the good folks from ELAP will be coming down to join us, and all are welcome for this important event. So on the next slide, just a couple about IAS. What we hear over and over again is that beyond the issue of pricing, which came up earlier, of course, it's incumbent on the laboratories to do due diligence and to figure out which third party is the most appropriate fit for them, or indeed if they should go with ELAP if they're a lab that's have not considered sophisticated in terms of equipment and methodology. So of course, pricing is a important factor. You know, we'd like to think of it as bigger than that in terms of value. So we hear consistently what's most important is in terms of points of distinction for our company is, do you have confidence in the business fundamentals, responsiveness, clarity of information sharing, confidence in this case in our assessors. You can see the sort of typical onboarding we do with our assessors. On a side note, we have several hundred all around the world operating in many countries. So that's a important criteria. And then beyond pricing is contributing to the community. So the monthly webinars we've been doing for the last couple of years have been highly valued, and we want to convey to the ELAP community that we're stewards of this, and we're trying to raise the level of knowledge to the benefit of all the stakeholders in this program. And then again, the California advantage is that, you know, we have a time zone, you know, responsiveness. We're on the West Coast, so we're always available, consistent with your time zones. So anyway, one more self-serving slide on the next slide. We're delighted that we've got some really marquee laboratories under our portfolio. and we're proud to be serving labs, private and public, from Weaverville up in the far northwest of the state, down to Chula Vista, out to in Phoenix as well. So this is just a sampling of some of our customers, and we're really feel like we're accelerating in this area, and we're really happy about it. So with that in mind, that's my pitch for the company. And I'd like to hand over the presentation to my friend and colleague, Harry.
I hope everyone can hear me okay. As Duncan said, we're approaching lunchtime over here, so I'll make my side or my presentation pretty short. IES basically looked at information from assessments conducted or performed within the last 1 year from 2022 to 2023. Similar to how we do it for ELAP, we also look at some of our other programs assessments to gather information, and we're able to compile all this data in like an Excel spreadsheet and be able to tell under which clauses we see a lot more findings, which clauses we see less findings, and sometimes we see a trend where the labs need help on some requirements versus some requirements labs have it down, and you never see any findings issued against those requirements. So as the slide says, this helps us identify areas of major concerns for labs, and also training. So once we're able to identify all these areas of concern or areas where we see repeat findings, IES frequently has assessor trainings where we get with our assessors and we show them the findings that we see that are most common and ways to deal with these findings, close these findings, and that also helps assessors collaborate with the labs in ensuring you don't see these assessment findings during their next assessment. Also providing input to other labs. That's right. That last point there was just talking about training for our labs. As Duncan mentioned earlier, we do have frequent training webinars where we discuss a variety of issues, not only technical, management system, ELAP specific, TNI specific, and all of these are free webinars. So a lot of these issues that we see during assessments are talked about during these webinars. Next slide, please. So the next couple slides are a review of some of our common assessment findings that we see. Some might be more common than others. There isn't really any general order to how we've got these on here. And since we're a little short on time, I'll kind of breeze through them and go through them real quick. So the first one that we have here is regarding calibration. And calibration, and for the finding that we saw against the requirement, it was specific for a thermometer calibration. So calibration overall is a big issue that we see with labs. A lot of times the calibration thermometers or other pieces of equipment don't have their calibration dates, or it's not labeled, and on the labels you don't see the calibration date or when the next calibration is due. So calibration issues are always a big one. And for that second one, equipment, they don't use a recognized traceable reference, bracketing the range of use. Sometimes labs don't have a NIST reference thermometer that they're calibrating their thermometers against. So that's usually one of the findings we see. And the last part of that sentence says it's bracketing the range of use, which most labs have been able to see these as repeat findings and been able to fix these issues. But just an overall quick example would be the labs measuring something at 15 degrees Celsius, but then they're calibrating their thermometers for that from 30 to 45 degrees Celsius. So that's what we mean by bracketing the range of use, where the calibration doesn't cover the range of use of the actual thermometer being used to measure the temperature of samples. And that bracketing the range of use is very important because, like I said, we've seen labs improving with this, but it's still an issue with some labs. Next slide, please. Okay, next one is requirement for sterility, dust, electromagnetic disturbances, radiation, humidity, as appropriate to the technical activities concerned. So we see that some labs don't pay attention to sterility. In this case, the assessor observed analysis in micro using 9223 was not performed under aseptic conditions, as lab procedure involves the analyst tapping the media packet directly onto the lid of a sterile sample vessel, the sample vessel multiple times. This is also something we see with some labs. I was just at a lab a few days ago where we were checking, we were like, intently making sure that when they are adding media to sample or to bottles, that they weren't tapping it onto the lids to get everything out, and everything was under aseptic conditions. So this is another thing that labs have picked up on and been able to improve over time and with, successive assessments. And then, could you go back to that last slide, please? Okay, thank you. So the second one on that was the SOP differing from the reference method or from the analyst process. So sometimes we see that, I'll just kind of briefly go over this, that the SOPs or the methods or the lab's SOPs based on the actual methods themselves aren't really being followed by the lab. If they're supposed to vortex for a certain amount of time, they're not really doing it according to what is in their own SOPs, or it's not being recorded. The time that they're supposed to be doing isn't being recorded. So, how do you know that the analyst is sticking to the time they're supposed to be doing? So issues like this where analyst is differing from what their SOP says is another issue. Next slide, please. All right, for the requirement, regression, calibration, factor calibrations. So those are the requirements that the minimum number of non-zero calibration standards should meet those specifications. And on that, the finding was the records for lead analysis had 4 standards when a linear fit was used. Real quick, the next one is regarding PT. I know PT is also another overall a big issue where, sometimes labs might not be passing successive PTs, or, just outright not doing them for all their fields of testing or fields of accreditation that they're seeking. And in that second one, I think, the finding where there are just no records. So, the lab's just not doing PT for those. Next slide, please. So this is kind of just a rough overview of some of the specifics that we saw coming to documentation. Lab isn't always including or referencing their procedures and policies in the quality manual. Lab might have a separate SOP or procedure policy, but it's just not part of the quality manual. There might not be any control information on the actual quality manual itself. These additional documents aren't being referenced in any way, so there's no way to tie them to the quality manual, quality management system. And then traceability. Overall, traceability as a whole is important, but for specific items that we've listed here, sometimes data from reagents and standards aren't being recorded. Equipment used might not be recorded. Temperature is not recorded each day of use, holidays and weekends. That's another big one that we see. Sometimes you might have incubators only being recorded in the morning on weekends, and then there's no temperature being recorded in the evening. And even though the lab has samples in there that they're running, so that becomes an issue when they're not doing it twice a day. And then support equipment balances and other equipment aren't being calibrated within their required time frame. Most labs set the time frame where they're doing it at least once a year for most equipment, but sometimes labs aren't able to meet that time frame. Next slide, please. Again, just touching over proficiency testing real quick. Labs might not be doing proficiency testing in all fields or might not be passing successive PTs or might not have records for the PTs that they're doing. Internal procedures, SOPs don't follow their reference methods, SOPs are incomplete, and not all staff receive data integrity training, which is a big one. Sometimes some labs might do internal data integrity training or external, but some labs are just not doing that data integrity training at all. Next slide, please. Okay, last few slides here. So some of the outputs that we see, obviously labs are still transitioning to the new TNI -2. So it's a learning curve, and like I said, labs keep getting better with each successive assessment. More training is required, and like I said, we usually offer a lot of training on these webinars where we're identifying key issues, and this has helped labs a lot in being able to fix the findings that we see usually. Next slide, please. The outputs too, structural requirements are improving, but getting better. These, like I said, similar findings that we used to see a lot more often, still there, but gradually reducing. And then many findings on basic management system requirements. Sometimes you see a lot of labs that are technically sound and technically are very good, but then when it comes to your daily management system tasks and processes, sometimes labs are lacking on those. Next slide, please. All right, thank you. I know we know we're a few minutes late or past our time, but if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us through our website or our info line. Thank you.
Ray, thank you so much. We appreciate your presentation, and we appreciate all the TPAs joining us and all of the knowledge that they shared. It's hard to believe that was our last presentation of ELAP Con 2023. I have just a few things that I want to mention before we blast off for the year. ELAP works hard to provide as many resources for our laboratories as possible. As you can see on your screen, I've listed out a few of those resources. I think Kate and Chris did a great job checking off most of these, but just in case you missed that, our website is full of information, just lots of tabs, lots of information there. And I know Kate specifically went over the timeline guidance tool, and also our ELAP email list is also available there. Also on our YouTube channel, as she demonstrated, are all of our previous ELAP conferences, including last year's, which has that extra ethics training that you can use in your laboratories to meet that TNI requirement, as well as all of the presentations from the TNI documentation workshop. And I just put a few more ELAP email addresses in case you don't have them, just to have them available here as well. The great ways to get in touch with us, and we do make it a point to get back to you as quickly as we can using those inboxes. I also wanted to mention that we will be doing our best to provide contact hours for several of the presentations this year. Teams Live keeps an attendance log for us. We'll be sending out emails for those, but please be patient. It's our first year offering them, so there's a little bit of a learning curve for us on that. Our goal is to have them sent out to you in the next 6 weeks or so, just keep an eye on your inbox for that. And finally, I'd like to take a second to thank a few people. First off, my awesome co-chairs, Catlin Bloom and Leanne Castle. They've worked hard for months to put this together, not to mention having to put up with me through all of it. So I appreciate them and all of their help. And I'd like to take a moment to thank our steering committee. Your input and ideas were truly invaluable to making this conference relevant and applicable for our laboratories. We'd also like to thank all of our presenters for joining us and sharing their knowledge and experience. A huge thank you to ELAP's program manager, Christine Sotelo, for supporting us and working with us to make this conference possible. And most of all, a huge thank you to all of you for being here. We hope you enjoyed this conference and found the information beneficial. Please keep an eye on your inbox for the feedback survey. If you're not signed up for ELAP's email list, that's also available on our website, and we will be sending out the feedback survey through that avenue. We hope this conference brought you closer to being ready to launch, and we look forward to seeing you again next year.